Welcome, Professor Khiara Bridges, Dr. Bridges. Do you prefer doctor or professor?
Professor is good for me, yes.
Okay. So Professor Bridges is at Berkeley Law School, having been at BU Law School for, I don't know, how many years was it? It was a while.
9 years, 9 years.
Yeah, and during that time in Boston and now at Berkeley, she's just been incredibly prolific. Certainly entered the legal academy with a dissertation that she had finished, and that's when I met her at Columbia when she was doing her dissertation in anthropology and a JD in the law school, and doing really, it's such important and interesting and rigorous work, ethnographic work, looking at how reproductive health care was or was not being delivered in a urban New York hospital. And I will draw you out in a moment to talk maybe a little bit more about that work, but the dissertation research has been a font also, I think, of further writing beyond the first book, which was Reproducing Race and Ethnography of Pregnancy as a Site of Racialization from 2011. And in that book, she talks a lot through this ethnographic work about how pregnancy becomes an opportunity for excessive and intrusive state supervision, management, and regulation of pregnant people's lives, particularly Black and brown pregnant people's lives. And we see some of that certainly in this new piece as well. But also, I think out of that piece came concerns about over-medicalization and how the process of racialization also threatens the privacy interests of pregnant people. And so the second book, The Poverty of Privacy Rights, picks up on that surveillance component of the first book and takes it much further. And then having two books in such short order was not enough. There's a third that she's been working on, a critical race theory primer, and such an important book that all of you should have, introducing you to the important and fundamental ideas of critical race theory, which have run throughout this course in this Frontline series, to be sure. But just stepping back for a second, Professor Bridges was a valedictorian graduate of Spelman College. Lauren Smith, who's at least on my screen sitting right next to you, also went to Spelman, and she's one of the people who will be kind of stepping up to engage you in the paper today. As I mentioned, she got her JD and PhD in anthropology from Columbia, and many other amazing things, but one I'll just mention is that she's also a classically trained ballet, do we still say ballerina or ballet person? Dancer.
We say ballet dancer, yes. Yeah. Ballerinas are weird.
Tortoise, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so she's classically trained in ballet. So has a full and rich and varied life, and has a new piece that just came out in the NYU Law Review called Racial Disparities in Maternal Mortality, a comprehensive, deep indictment, really, of how we are not addressing the problem of particularly Black women dying in connection with pregnancy. And I just want to thank you for writing it and for sharing it with us today, and want to ask you to kind of talk a little bit about how why you decided to take this issue on in such a comprehensive way in this law review article.
Yeah, so first of all, again, thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. It's always a pleasure to come back to my alma mater, and also always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Katherine. So I came to this piece because I'm actually working on a fourth book. I'm working on a second ethnography. So my first ethnography is Reproducing Race, and it was came out of my dissertation research, working at, I did did 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork research at a public hospital in Manhattan. And I was looking at how pregnant people, navigated, healthcare systems in order to receive the prenatal care that they thought that they needed in order to have healthy pregnancies and give birth to healthy babies. Meanwhile, the healthcare system that we have erected for the poor is dignity denying, it's humanity denying, it's punitive, it's hyper regulatory, it surveils bodies, it problematizes bodies. So I had this scathing critique of the system that we have erected to provide healthcare for the most vulnerable. And the name of the book is Reproducing Race. So I was interested in race and how racial discourses produce these systems and how these systems produce racial discourses. One of the most common questions or maybe challenges that I get about reproducing race is this really about race or is this about class? And the assumption is that people are being treated poorly. The poor people of color who were being treated poorly in that book were being treated poorly because they were poor, not because they were people of color. And so the assumption there is that all is well among people of color who have some degree of class privilege. So the second ethnography seeks to ethnographically document the fact that race matters, even when you have class privilege. And the second ethnography will be an ethnography of class privileged people of color. So folks who have private health insurance, who are pregnant, who are navigating healthcare systems and looking at how race matters differently. Of course, race matters differently when you are class privileged, but it certainly matters. So one of the kind of primary pieces of evidence that I had that race matters for class privileged people of color is the fact of racial disparities in maternal mortality and the fact that these racial disparities in maternal mortality persist across income levels. So it is not that, people of color or 3 to 4 times as many Black people as white people die from pregnancy-related causes because Black people disproportionately bear the burdens of poverty. That's true. But even when one has class privilege, even when one is affluent, even when it's Beyonce, when one is Serena Williams, it is just more dangerous to become pregnant, to give birth, and to exist in a postpartum period. So I came to the fact of racial disparities in maternal mortality because that was the evidence that I had that for my hunch that race matters even when it's class privileged. And so once I turned my attention to racial disparities in maternal mortality, I discovered the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act. And there's just so much to say about the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act, as well as the discourse, the conversations that we're having in this country about maternal mortality and why it's a problem.
So there's an enormous demand to pre-order this book.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to allow for it to be pre-ordered as soon as I start writing it. So I just got IRB approval like 2 weeks ago. So I just got permission to actually do human subjects research. So it's going to be at least another 3 years before this book sees the light of day. Thank you for that.
Well, getting IRB approval is no small thing. So
oh my God. So for reproducing race, it took me 18 months. At Columbia's IRB, mind you, and over at UC Berkeley, it took me 12 months. So I'm getting better. I'm getting better at navigating these IRB processes.
Well, you also have a track record as a scholar, so I think that's gotta help a little bit. Yeah. So I would like us to unpack a little bit what you mean by racialization.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one naively might think you appear in either an emergency room or in an obstetric practice at a hospital, and you are read as a raced person, but
Mm-hmm.
you want to say something very different from that there is the actual care or lack of care.
Right.
It's a racializing experience or has racializing effects. So what does that mean?
So when I think of racialization, I think of how racial meanings are produced and reiterated, how they're learned, how people learn what it means to be a person of color in this country. We are constantly undergoing processes of racialization, right? And I undergo processes of racialization when I walk outside of my door, you know, here in the Bay Area, and people speak Spanish to me because they think that, you know, my coloring is such that I'm likely Latinx, right? And then I'm racialized by my status as a person of color in the legal academy, and the interactions that I have, you know, produce racial meanings and reiterate racial meanings. And so there's a banality to racialization, but I've always been interested in analyzing processes of racialization during the event of pregnancy. Just I've always been fascinated with pregnancy. And so I'm interested in how people learn what it means to be a person of color when they're pregnant, right? When they're undergoing, you know, prenatal care, when they're giving birth, when they're parenting the child that they birth. How are racial meanings produced in those encounters? And also, if racial meanings are constantly produced, then those are also encounters in which we can disrupt racial meanings and what it means to be a person of color, you know, and also a white person, et cetera.
Right. So let me just probe this a little bit more with you. I mean, as you well know better than I, because you have a PhD in anthropology and I don't. Patrick Wolf talked about colonialism as not an event, but a structure. And I've always found that to be a really useful idea in a whole lot of places. So what I hear, part of what you're saying is that racialization is not a fact, or racial meaning is not a fact, it's a structure.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
So in what way is it helpful to understand it as structurally rather than, you know, what it means to be Black is X?
Right. Well, so first of all, understanding it as a structure, and in my work, I frequently talk about it as a process. It underscores that it's not static, right? It's a fluid thing. So if we have racial hierarchy, it's not because we have inherited it from, you know, chattel slavery. And that's not that we've inherited it from, you know, the attempted genocide of Native people. If we have racial hierarchy, it's because we constantly reproduce it today. So understanding race as a structure, race as a process kind of underscores for me the constancy of those formations. And also, you know, when you mention structure, you know, colonialism or colonization as a structure, and race and racial hierarchy as a structure, you know, I immediately think back to reproducing race, and our two-tiered healthcare system is a structure by which racial meanings are produced. So with our two-tiered healthcare system, you know, for example, those on the bottom tier, those who receive Medicaid, they just get worse healthcare, period, full stop. It's just worse healthcare than if you're privately insured. And so what does that do? It means that we can't, you know, sicknesses, illnesses are not identified until late in the game. That you get worse healthcare once the sickness is identified. You're treated poorly as you're navigating these systems in order to be cured of the sickness. And so it just means that people of color who are disproportionately found in that lower tier of healthcare are sicker and they die earlier. And so that, you know, so what does race mean when you're sicker, right? When we can look at statistics and say, you know, Black people disproportionately suffer from asthma, and Black people disproportionately suffer from hypertension, and so we've created racial meanings around Blackness because of the structure of healthcare. And we've created racial meanings around whiteness because of the structure of healthcare. So that's those are sort of the questions that motivate me when I am analyzing. I've always thought of myself not as a scholar of race. I've come to think of myself now as a scholar of race, but I've always thought of myself as a scholar of racialization because I'm actually interested in race as a verb, you know, and not as a noun.
Yeah. What is it about that structure or process that has the either intent or effect, or maybe a little of both, of rendering certain raced people responsible for their oppression?
Right, absolutely.
Whereas white people, by and large, are not asked to be responsible for our privilege.
Right.
That's at all. Mm-hmm. So why does it work differently for the privileged group from the non-privileged group?
You know, so it's a great question, and it immediately made me think about The moral construction of, so Poverty of Privacy Rights, my second book, was, very much about the moral construction of poverty and how we individualize causes of poverty. The most popular explanation of poverty in the US today, and it has always been, not macro structural large scale forces, but rather like individual, personal failings. So people are poor not because the economy is such that middle skill jobs are just no longer as they're not as many of them as there used to be. We don't look to large scale explanations of poverty. Instead, we look to people are poor because they're lazy. People are poor because they're promiscuous and they keep having these babies out of wedlock, or people are poor because they just, rather make they can't delay gratification, right? So the moral construction of poverty is alive and well, right? So that's how we explain poverty in the hood. That's how we explain poverty amongst people of color, that they just need to get these educations and go out and do something with their life. Meanwhile, 2016 happened and we found that when white people disproportionately find themselves impoverished, we don't think about personal failures. We think Obama, like he exported all these jobs and immigration laws. We keep letting these undocumented people come in and steal jobs. And so structural explanations of poverty were available to people with class privilege. Meanwhile, those structural explanations of poverty have always been woefully unavailable to people without race privilege, right? So people of color have always found unavailable structural explanations of poverty. So to tie it into healthcare, individualize, making people responsible for their oppression is just such a ubiquitous phenomenon, right? In healthcare, because we think, and I talk about this in the paper, right? If people are literally dying at higher rates because people of color are dying at higher rates during pregnancy, instead of looking at like how are we as society killing people, literally killing people, instead we're like, well, they're obese. Are they having babies at later ages? And that might be the problem, right? They're making these decisions to delay childbearing. And then of course my personal vendetta, building my life around fighting this notion is just like, oh, it's in the genes. Black people have genes that predispose us to death. That's why we just keep dying from all these various causes. And those are kind of like paradigmatic, individualizing mechanisms, right? Individualizing the causes and effects of oppression. And it's a good way of making sure that we don't pay attention to, structures, right? Structure.
Well, it individualizes blame and responsibility, but it also at the same time exonerates the larger society, right, from any responsibility. So in what way does the Preventing Maternal Death Act actually collaborate in that project?
Well, the Preventing Maternal Death Act collaborates in the project by not calling out what we know is true about why people are dying, right? I think the biggest, the thing that's most offensive to me about the act is that it pretends that we don't know how to save people's lives, as if it's just like a lack of information. We need more information. Again, I'm not like one of those people who are like, information's bad, but I'm one of those people that when you have a limited sum of money, they decided that they're only going to spend, how much is it? $12,000, so $60 million. They decide they're going to spend $60 million on this issue. If you've decided that is a finite pot of money, I would not spend that money on gathering information. Instead, I would spend that money on making the concrete interventions that we know save people's lives. So I think the Preventing Maternal Death Act is complicit in this by pretending obliviousness, right? Or pretending that this is actually a problem of information as opposed to a problem of political will, a problem of anti-Blackness.
Yeah, exactly. Towards the end of the paper, you make this turn to police violence.
Yeah.
In the service of an idea about racial erasure. So there's the racialization ideas that you draw from your other work and then put to work here, and then this idea of racial erasure. Talk to us about what that move is and what you hope we get from the turn to police violence.
I think that was part of me trying to make sense of the political calculus that advocates for the act and advocates for, people who have been agitating around the Black maternal health crisis. I was trying to just be a little bit more sympathetic to the political calculus that they had to make. Because the reality is that if this was the, Preventing Black Maternal Deaths Act, it never would have seen the light of day. If this was the, Racial Justice and Childbearing Act, again, never would have seen the light of day. It would have died a brutal death in somebody's committee. And so it had to engage, in order to get through the Congress as it was constituted in 2018, it had to pretend that this was just like a maternal death or maternal health crisis as opposed to a Black maternal health crisis. And so the comparison to officer-involved homicides is, I critique that the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act constructs this as an issue of information, the lack of information. But then when you compare it to officer-involved homicides, we don't even want to gather information about officer-involved homicides. And so, and part of the reason that we don't want to gather information about officer-involved homicides is because we understand it as an issue of racial justice. The people who are being slaughtered in the street disproportionately are people of color. So that was me making sense of the racial erasure in terms of just political pragmatics, right? We have a will not to know in the context of officer-involved homicides. Meanwhile, we have a newly discovered will to know in the context of maternal deaths. But in order to even generate that will to know, we had to pretend that this is not an issue of racial justice.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting about, whatever issue you might be working on, some of them would require a brighter spotlight to bring awareness, and others, it's right in the open, right? You don't need it. And it seems you're saying the latter around this issue. So what should the Biden administration do? What bill should they put together? You're talking about.
I know. What should Biden do? Well, they shouldn't do what Kamala Harris did before, which was, engage in sort of implicit racialization and othering of, third world. But I think that the Biden administration has a beautiful precedent in what California did. So California went from a state that had one of the highest levels or highest rates of maternal deaths. And we went to a state that has one of the lower rates of maternal deaths. And we did it, sadly, I'm sort of struggling with this concept, but we did it through standardization. So we have safety bundles that have been implemented in all of the hospitals, and it requires drills. So everybody working in the hospital knows how to respond when people present with certain issues. There's policies around antenatal care, postpartum care. So it's the standardization that has worked to save lives in California. So if we did something like a standardization, right? Again, Biden administration, all they have to do is look to California, and they'll see a great precedent for something that is effective.
Mm-hmm. So what you're describing is not a race-specific remedy. You're basically just recommending, or California did, raising the standard of care,
right,
for all people in the context of giving birth or prenatal care as well, it sounds like.
Right. So I am really struggling with this, and I have begun typing out, chapter 1 of this new ethnography that's going to hit your shelves in, 2027. But I'm really struggling with, what does racial justice look like? Does it look like it's our only hope for racial justice in late capitalism system design? Is that what we can only, we can't, I'm struggling with whether it's the architecture of our institutions that might save us, as opposed to, the actors within the systems. And so what I do know is a fact that I actually discovered after writing Reproducing Race, which is that the racial disparities in infant mortality is actually, there are smaller racial disparities in infant mortality among Medicaid recipients than there are among privately insured. So Medicaid has functioned to eliminate racial inequality, not wholly, but to some extent, right? Poor Black babies and poor white babies are dying at rates that are more similar to one another than the rates at which wealthier white babies and wealthier Black babies are. And I know that it is a function of everything that I critiqued in Reproducing Race. I know that it's a function of the standardization. I know that it's a function of the elimination of discretion in the clinical encounter. And so what it doesn't touch, of course, is what happens pre-clinical encounter, right? So people of color are going into their pregnancies and going into their encounters with their prenatal care providers already damaged by structural racism. And so what California does is say, okay, taking that, taking the already, the illness and the pathology that's already been produced by structural racism, let's not exacerbate it by allowing folks to encounter worse care. Let's in fact regularize it at this moment. And so it's worked to some extent, right? So again, I'm struggling with this idea that like our hope for racial justice, this racial utopia might in fact just be institutional design as opposed to, I don't know, something, when I was in law school, I thought it was going to be through law. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, law is often the problem more than the solution. But I think it's interesting, we started off talking about racialization and that was really A, what interested you, and B, what you felt was what was going on in the hugely disproportionate number of Black women who were dying in connection with childbirth or pregnancy. Yet the solution is not a racialized solution, at least as you're recommending. It's one that kind of lifts the floor, I think. And incidentally, other non-Black people will be benefited by this, surely. But it is interesting that you're not proposing a racial lens on the solution, since the criticism of the act is that it doesn't include race.
In my defense, though, you said, what should Biden do? You said, what should a Biden administration do? And I said, look to California. But what the next 40 years should do is look all around at the various inputs, right, that have made people of color, specifically sicker, have shortened their lives in this country. And so we're talking about residential segregation, we're talking about environmental injustices, we're talking about just the physiological effects of being a person of color in a nation that is as committed to white supremacy as this nation is. So we're talking about education and the fact that we fund our schools through property tax, which does a beautiful job of making sure that kids in the hood have underfunded schools while kids in the suburbs have iPads. So like, those are like the macro processes that I think are bigger than the Biden administration, which of course I think the Biden administration should take on some of it. But if we're looking at the discrete the discrete moment or the just discrete context of maternal health, then you can do what California did.
Right. Well, is it possible to imagine a world in which we could combine specific healthcare related reforms with those other reforms more comprehensively?
So, I mean, so I definitely can imagine a world in which we say that in order to improve the health outcomes in the United States of America, we are doing X, Y, and Z things, and those things it don't intuitively smack of health, right? So when we're talking about reforming the way that we fund public schools, it doesn't intuitively, implicate health, but it certainly does. environmental injustices and you know, and internalizing externalities. So it's not more profitable for a company to, you know, just pollute everybody in an area as opposed to, you know, coming up with a different technology, right? It doesn't intuitively smack of health, but it certainly has health impact. So I think what I'm getting at is we can make these reforms knowing that they impact health, but I don't think that we necessarily have to label them as kind of efforts to address health inequities, when in fact they will address health inequities.
Right. So you're really worried, I mean, you're not worried, you're alerting us to the fact that we have to think race and racialization differently, but also what health means.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Before you joined us, we were talking about the difference between reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And it's very much a reproductive justice framework that would rule in many of these other issues that you're talking about.
It's so prior to the clinical encounter. I think a lot of times we think of health as like, okay, so you go to the doctor, and then what happens, and then you have access to your medicine, but health is so much bigger than, I mean, health can be, in a conversation about health, especially racial inequities in health, you know, I talk about Jim Crow because there is evidence that there are epigenetic, you know, changes to people of color's, you know, phenotype. And so I'm living my grandmother's environment. My grandmother was a maid during Jim Crow in the South, right? And so if racism has impacted the expression of her genes, I've inherited it, and that, you know, makes me much more likely to die during pregnancy than my race privileged, you know, counterpart. So it's huge, it's big, but all of it is impacting health. Yeah.
So Professor Bridges, I'm going to pass the baton here to Lauren Smith. There are 3 students who have particularly stepped up today to talk to all of us and you about the paper. So I'm going to invite Lauren to pose a few questions now.
Hi, Professor Bridges. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us this afternoon. And it's always an absolute joy to be in community with another Spelman alumna.
Always, yes.
So my question for you is, towards the end of the article, you mentioned that, you know, we'll see what becomes of the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act. And so I'm wondering whether you think that the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act is a lost cause or really a foreseeable failure in actually reducing maternal mortality rates for Black women, given that, as you mentioned, it completely erases any mention of race and its language, focuses on the redundant task of data collection, and potentially has hazardous consequences of more surveillance and regulation of Black women. So, you know, is it this lost cause? Is it a foreseeable failure, or should we be pushing for reforms to the act? And if so, what kind of reform should we be pushing for?
So I think that the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act itself is a lost cause. Like, I have no hope at all that it will, first of all, it's not designed to eliminate racial disparities in health, right? It's just designed to improve maternal health outcomes in the US. So I have no hope at all that it will actually eliminate racial disparities in health. But moreover, I don't think it's actually going to impact maternal health in the US as a general matter, because it does not dedicate money to that. There's no money. There's no financial commitment to implement. So even if a maternal mortality review committee said, you know what, this person died because there was obstetrics desert. There's obstetrics deserts in DC, right? There's an obstetrics desert and she had to travel 40 miles to get the care that she needed. That's why she died. We don't have any money. There's no money in the act to remedy that issue. And so then we would need a recommitment, right? Like, okay, so are we going to spend $60 million now to build more, make sure that obstetrics wards don't close? Are we actually going to fund Medicaid at a level where hospitals that have large numbers of Medicaid patients aren't operating in the red? Are we going to actually put the money into solving this problem? And I'm worried that we will have exhausted our political will. If you go to, I'm forgetting the name of representative who sort of has taken credit for, she's the one who introduced it in the House. It's all over her page. Like, she's like, I did this. Like, you're welcome, Preventing Maternal Deaths Act. And so I'm worried that we will have exhausted our political will to do something about the maternal health problem that we have in the US because we have passed the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act.
Thank you. And a follow-up question I have there in regards to the point of exhausting our political will and really just how to use our political will and the funds that we have in the space. Your research indicated that in the last 25 years, I think it was about 158 countries had reduced their maternal mortality rates while the US experienced an uptick. So what are your thoughts on why the US doesn't just adopt some of those successful policies of those other countries, given that we have the resources?
Socialism. So it's American exceptionalism. Like, this is a prime example of America, the US, thinking that it is distinct from other countries in a way that disallows us from being inspired by, again, the things that we know work in other countries. For example, this is somewhere in the footnotes, I think, but the US has a number of deaths every, I think a dozen, maybe 2 dozen deaths from blood clots that develop in a person who has a cesarean section. The UK has 0 deaths from people who suffer from blood clots traveling to the lungs or brain or et cetera after having a cesarean section. What has the UK done? Well, the UK has simply mandated, so we're talking about the National Health Services here. So we have single payer system, boogeyman. So we have, the UK has mandated that everybody who receives a cesarean, they just have to wear like compression stockings. So the NHS says, if you're a provider in the NHS system, make sure that a person is wearing compression stockings after having a cesarean. Has eliminated deaths from, blood clots following that particular surgery. The US doesn't look to it, right? Because of American exceptionalism, from the idea that regulating healthcare and regulating health providers is some sort of form of socialism that's anti-American. So that's the answer to your question. Is this a belief that our Constitution somehow makes us immune to or requires our obliviousness to other countries and what they're doing to improve the quality of their citizens' lives and their residents' lives.
Okay. It sounds like a lot of that culture of American exceptionalism interacts with the lack of political will, or is a direct consequence of the lack of political will to really make effective changes in this area.
Absolutely. And white supremacy as well, and racism.
I will pass it on to my colleague, Sarah, for a few other questions that she has. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Professor Bridges, for joining us. I really enjoyed reading your article, and I'm still learning about the US context, so I apologize if my questions are a bit basic, but in a part of your article, you mentioned that in high Black serving hospitals, white women are also provided inferior healthcare. Am I correct?
Yeah.
And so I just want to understand why. Is it because the hospital is situated in an area closer to a neighborhood that is predominantly Black or low income, or what? Could you just please explain to me why this is happening?
Right. So high Black serving hospitals tend to be underfunded relative to their, low Black serving hospital counterparts. They tend to have sicker patients as well. And when you have sicker patients, it just means that you have to improve the quality of the care that you give to your patients. If they come in with, many more comorbidities than, a more privileged population, it doesn't mean that the people should die at all. It just means that you have to up your A game. And so what you have are sicker patients who need better care, but you're underfunded, so you can't provide the care that you would need in order to save their lives. And so the result is that it's institutional in the sense that the institution doesn't have the means to provide adequate health care. And so anybody coming into the hospital is going to suffer, including white people. So the problem is its status as a high Black serving hospital, as opposed to sort of the interpersonal interactions that are happening inside of the institution. I think of it like this. So I have this like long quote from Reproducing Race that I could probably find them. I have a slide of it. And it's this quote in which a resident explains to me the difference between alpha and omega. So alpha in Reproducing Race is the public hospital. It's the hospital that takes Medicaid, it's the poor person's hospital, it's the safety net hospital, yada, yada, yada. Omega sits right next door to alpha. Omega is the private hospital. Omega doesn't take Medicaid. So you have this like physical manifestation of the haves and the have-nots. If you have private insurance, there's no way you're walking through Alpha's doors. You're just gonna go to Omega next door, right? Meanwhile, Omega doesn't take Medicaid, so you have to go to Alpha. So again, strict separation of the haves and the have-nots. The residency that is associated with Alpha Hospital, the residents split their time between Alpha and Omega. And so I asked one of the residents to explain to me the difference between practicing medicine and Alpha and Omega, because they literally go between them every day. And what he explained to me is that one, the actual equipment in Omega is better, because they have the money to buy new equipment, right? We're talking about technology, which constantly shifts, right? Constantly improves, if you will. So they have the money to constantly upgrade their equipment, Meanwhile, Alpha is sitting around with equipment from like the early 2000s, the 1990s. At the same time, Omega has more of these pieces of equipment. Over at Alpha, they have fewer of these pieces of equipment. So what happens is if you go to Omega Hospital, you're getting better care. You're waiting a shorter period of time for better care. If you go to Alpha Hospital, you're waiting a longer period of time for inferior care. Alpha Hospital is like a high Black serving hospital, right? You have inferior equipment, you have fewer pieces of that equipment. And so the care that everybody's going to get inside of a high Black serving hospital is going to be inferior, whether, without regard to your racial description or identification.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I have another question. It's a bit unrelated, but it's just me trying to find hope in all of this. So towards the end of the article, you mentioned that in 2018, New York City has taken some steps to address maternal mortality in the city. So have you read or observed any positive change following that? Or are we able to tell how effective these measures were?
Yeah, not yet. So it's still too early. I do know that there hasn't been much change, the data coming out. So New York City, the maternal mortality rates, the disparities, Black people were 12 times, we're dying at 12 times the rate as white people. So the data coming out and that's also part of New York City's intervention, is that they want to get data out more quickly because we wait 5, 6, 7 years for numbers. So people don't know whether the interventions that are being made are actually effective, and whether we should, stay the course, or whether we should, switch course. All that to say, the numbers haven't come out. I haven't seen any updated numbers, but from the story, the sort of conversations that I've been having on the ground, any improvement, people are wondering whether it's because of the interventions that New York City has mandated, which is something along the lines of, doula care is covered, but only in certain counties. Implicit bias training, yes, that was a huge eye roll. The interventions, there's skepticism about whether it's actually going to do what needs to be done, but we'll have to see when the data comes out.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Sabrina.
Hi, I'm Sabrina. Thank you so much for being with us today. I also have a few questions for you. So one thing I was really interested in your article is your article uses mostly statistics to talk about the disparities in maternal mortality, while some of your other work uses the ethnographic approach. And I was wondering how you decided between these two approaches and why you did so.
Yeah, so that's a function of being housed in a law school. So I'm at UC Berkeley School of Law. I'm not at UC Berkeley Department of Anthropology. And so I'm at a law school. And so, you know, these are institutional concerns. And this is a conversation I love having. But the way that law schools are run, law professors like myself, we don't have time available to us all the time to do kind of ethnographic work. So I have to sort of save up my time so that I can get a period of time free from teaching in order to do the sort of deep dive ethnographic work that Reproducing Race does, and which I will do for this new ethnography. All that to say, because of my inability to do ethnography, at the time that I was looking into racial disparities to writing this particular article, I relied on what's already out there. And what's out there are numbers, it's stats. And so when I do engage in the ethnographic interrogation of the issues that I'm sort of analyzing in this article, and I plan to do that, have a teaching leave for spring 2022, then that's where the sort of the qualitative, you know, ethnographic stuff will come with that research. So it's just a function of me having to write a piece, an article, without being able to go out in the real world and see what it looks like on the ground.
Gotcha. And then another thing I was curious about, I don't know if you started researching this, but you mentioned in the introduction that you are interested in exploring why the issue of racial disparities in maternal mortality all of a sudden became kind of like this lightning strike. Everyone's interested in it. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd really love to hear them.
Yeah, I don't know. And I'm certainly not the only one who's wondering, like, why now? I mean, so part of it is agitation. So there have been reproductive justice organizations who have been on the ground fighting about this very issue, you know, since at least the 1970s, you know. But I mean, I think celebrity has something to do with it as well. Like, you know, Serena Williams comes out, like one of the most privileged people in the world, also one of the probably healthiest people in the world, almost died. And I think that kind of helped to bring attention to this issue. So I think celebrity has something to do with it. I think agitation, I think organization, you know, social movements always have something to do with it. There might be a piece in there that's about like the business of journalism. So I forgot what magazine published Serena Williams' story, but what I noticed was that, you know, US News did a story, and then NPR did a story, and then the New York Times did a long form story, and then, you know, then Elle magazine, and then so I'm thinking there's like also some sort of investigation into like the business of journalism and how there might be some sort of incentive to some sort of financial incentives, you know, to be clear, to cover a story that has gotten press in other sort of competitors, by other competitors.
Okay, thanks. And then also last week we discussed the drug testing of birth parents, which we know that you've also done research on. And I was wondering what kind of parallels and connections you see between that, like deprivation of a privacy right, and when it comes to the rights of poor parents and maternal mortality. And yeah.
Yeah. So it's this actually goes back to Professor Franke's question that she was asking me earlier, like what's the solution, right? So we know that when it's left to provider discretion, poor people and people of color are going to be the ones who get screened for substances. And so what's the solution, right? Is the solution regularization? So you screen everyone or no one? You know, what does racial equity look like in that particular context? So I think I would answer your question just by making reference to provider discretion and the way that provider discretion can function to bring into play these discourses that, you know, have damned people of color since time immemorial in the country, and then ultimately end up producing inequitable outcomes, but also ultimately end up reaffirming what we think we already know, right? So we think we already know that poor people use drugs at higher rates than wealthier people. And so we only screen poor people, and we discover, oh my God, poor people are using drugs and wealthy people are not. So we produce these knowledges that function to reaffirm our realities. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, does anyone else in the class have any questions?
I'm gonna pose another question, then please start raising your hands. I'd love to hear other folks jump in. One, I just want to go back to Sarah's question about high Black serving hospitals and the experiences of other people who are not Black in those hospitals. We did it, I think you probably know this, at our Law, Rights, and Religion project, we did a study a couple of years ago of Catholic hospitals and the prevalence of Catholic hospitals in the country and how they're controlled by the religious directives on particularly reproductive care. And that there was, in a number of communities, Black people were, and Black women were disproportionately kind of stuck with Catholic healthcare because these Catholic hospitals were in communities that served largely communities of color. So I'm wondering if there's any overlap between what you're talking about in terms of when you talk about alpha and omega and, you know, those that kind of example, but also how many alphas, or is there a degree to which the alphas tend to be more Catholic hospitals? That you know, the Catholic Church prides itself on providing service to poor communities. When we criticize them for not giving the full spectrum of reproductive health care, they say, yes, but we're showing up in communities that are underserved as it is.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, good for you. And, but then we give inadequate care as a matter of policy, not as, you know, oh, too bad we're not funded enough.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you've seen in any of your work a correlation, at least, between the Catholic nature of hospitals and the care, inadequate care or inferior care that women of color are getting.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I haven't seen anything yet in my research because I haven't looked into that issue, but I think that's an area that's like ripe for investigation, and thanks for the lead. I will say, just as a preliminary matter, you know, I've been thinking about Louisiana in large part because I, you know, wrote an amicus brief for June Medical Services versus Rousseau, and you all might be familiar, but that was last term, I believe it was, and Louisiana tried to shut down 2 out of 3 of their abortion clinics. And the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so the brief that I authored was just a framing of abortion as a reproductive justice issue. Is a kind of a response to Justice Thomas waxing philosophically about, you know, race and eugenics and abortion and Fox versus Planned Parenthood. So anyway, I started thinking about the context of Louisiana specifically. And Louisiana has the worst, it's fighting with Mississippi, but it has the worst ratios of maternal mortality in the country. Also, incredible racial disparities in maternal mortality. So not only is it doing a bad job of protecting pregnant people's health, period, but it's doing a miserable, even more miserable job of protecting pregnant people of color's health and Black pregnant people specifically. But so there's much to do there with Catholic hospitals, right? In Louisiana, and the obstetrics deserts that we know existed, and who is actually popping up, you know, and who is in fact the hospital that people have to travel 50 miles to get to. It just may be the Catholic hospital that refuses to provide adequate reproductive care as a general, as a matter of policy, as you said. So yeah, it's worth investigating further. Yeah.
Well, let's stay in touch on this, because that report is called Bearing Faith, for those of you who might want to look it up on the Law, Rights, and Religion Project's website. That report didn't document this issue of a correlation between disproportionately Black people in the catchment area and the Catholic hospital, but in the South, because places like Boston have a lot more Catholic hospitals than they do in the South. So the project we're doing right now is looking at religiously affiliated hospitals in the South that are not Catholic. And there's a lot more Baptist. There used to be Seventh-day Adventist hospitals. And they, those religions are tough to research because they don't have a mothership like the Vatican.
Right.
Putting out policy. To be Baptist is a really different thing in different places, and they don't have a centralized sort of set of policies. So it's taking a lot of time to do this, but we'll stay in touch about what we're learning in the South.
Please do. And just an anecdote, and I'm an anthropologist and I like to tell stories. So the reason I am here right with you today, but also on the planet, is because of a Catholic hospital. So when my brother, my older brother, was born, my mom went to a Catholic hospital to deliver. And when, she's delivering, she's like, oh, this is it. Tubal ligation, please. And they were like, no, we don't do that here. You have to go somewhere else. So before she could actually go somewhere else, here I am. So.
Well, I guess, thank you, Jesus. That's so funny. Natalie, you have a question.
Hi, Professor Bridges. Thank you so much for all the insight you shared with us today. I wanted to revisit an earlier point that you raised, which is the dilemma you have between advocating for more large-scale institutional designs as opposed to transformation, I guess, on a more individual level and enacting more laws. Do you see these two paths as separate? Do you prioritize, the former over the latter? Do you ever see those two paths converging? And I think it's very interesting that you mentioned how within the Medicaid patients, there's less disparity for maternal mortality. But at the same time, I wonder how standardization can be achieved without more surveillance, without more intrusion, without directly addressing, the lack of dignity that many colored people face, not only within the healthcare aspects of their lives, but throughout their lives. So I think you've actually referenced this in your article as well. So I would love to hear your thoughts about this.
Yeah, so you have gotten to one of the tensions that I have discovered in this work, is that the things that we know might save people's lives, the regularization, the standardization, might actually have the effect of just increasing the surveillance and regulation of people and people of color, specifically. So going back to the UK, one of the interventions, so, when I present my work in the UK, people say, oh my gosh, you guys, I've gotten more than one, because you guys should do what we do here. We have these baby boxes, and what happens is that, we send mothers home with a baby box, and the baby box is filled with stuff for the baby, but also it's like a makeshift crib so that people don't put the baby in the bed. And then they're like, and that's not the problem. The problem is they're like, and then we make sure that, the postpartum person gets, this home visit by a nurse. So nurses visit the home and they just make sure that the, breastfeeding's going well, if that's what they're doing, but the formula is being made properly and that the baby's sleeping in the right place. And then I always think when people tell me that, that sounds horrible. It sounds horrible in the US because I mean, I just know that's precisely what poor parents are enduring. Like today, like people are coming to their house and they're checking to make sure that there's milk in the refrigerator. And when there's not milk in the refrigerator, instead of giving them milk, like we remove children from their homes. So I'm with you, and I've observed the tension, and it's one of the tensions that I want to work out in this next ethnography is that, you know, what if racial justice looks like standardization, not racial justice, what if racial equity looks like standardization and regularization? And what if that has the effect of producing the systems that I critique so thoroughly in reproducing race, right? These systems that are just hyper surveilling, you know, just over surveilling people and denying heterogeneity within a population. It's one of the big sort of themes of reproducing race, is that the poor, right, is a heterogeneous population. There's so much heterogeneity within the poor, and what Medicaid comes in and does is just treat them all the same and homogenizes this heterogeneity. What if that's what racial equity looks like, right? So you've just identified a tension that I'm looking forward to sort of working through. And I don't have any answers, but I'm looking forward to sort of working and thinking through that tension. And just with your first question, you were saying, you know, the tension between sort of large scale reform and can it converge with kind of like individual or context specific efforts. And I think that it can, and I think that it probably should. I think that we have to think about health broadly, while also making the context specific and, you know, interventions in institutions or hospitals or Medicaid funding or what have you, in order to improve health outcomes in the US. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Those are great questions. Lauren, I saw you had your hand up again.
Yes, so another question that I have for you, Professor Bridges, is that you mentioned that the reaction to the US's high maternal mortality rate is that this shouldn't be happening here in public discourse. And then earlier at another point in your paper, you also just kind of mentioned the tension between the different response to police brutality in terms of the slaughtering of Black bodies at the hands of the police. And so I'm wondering if you could just kind of talk about the difference in responses in public discourse, in that when it comes to high maternal mortality rates, is that this shouldn't be happening here. And there's just a very different narrative or public discourse that goes on after police brutality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question.
And maybe more specifically, do you think that that reaction is because this is a gendered issue, or is that because it's both a gender and racial issue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really rich question. Let me think out loud and talk out loud to answer it. So I guess if you had to think about how embarrassment, like I love the concept of embarrassment because it presupposes an outsider that is judging and that we are judging ourselves, you know, through that outsider. So when you look at how embarrassment, this kind of idea of embarrassment is working in the context of maternal health, we're like, this shouldn't be happening here because there's an outsider who, you know, who is judging us and who we are judging ourselves by, and that outsider is making us think that this does not belong, you know, in an industrialized country that's wealthy, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to, so I gotta say that's an improvement, right? Like that. So I problematize the discourse of it shouldn't be happening here because it's racialized and it's racist. Mm-hmm. But to think of to have a shame about a phenomenon that is occurring in the U.S. is a step above not having any shame about it whatsoever. And that's what we're seeing in the context of officer-involved homicides. That's what we're seeing in the context of mass incarceration, just like generally. Like we should, I look forward to the day when we become embarrassed by the statistics that we have around incarceration in this country. Like I look forward to the day when we say this shouldn't be happening here, when we're talking about just the millions of people who we're caging. And I look forward to the day when we say this shouldn't be happening here, about, you know, just executions in the streets in communities of color. So I also don't think it's necessarily a progression that you have to go through the stage of embarrassment before you get to an actual nuanced discourse around maternal health or police homicide. But I will say that if one is embarrassed by a phenomenon, it's certainly an improvement over being, you know, having no shame. I mean, just think of Trump, right? Like, I would love if Trump at any moment had been ashamed or even self-aware enough to be ashamed. But so anyway, so that's one thing. And on your question of the gendered nature of it, I mean, I definitely think gender is playing some role in the attention that we're giving to maternal health. Because if cisgender womanhood is supposed to line up with anything within, you know, traditional understanding, you know, traditional gender norms, it's supposed to be motherhood. And so when people are doing what they're supposed to do, when cisgender people are doing what they're supposed to do and they're dying, then it's more likely to be the stuff of national shame than, you know, a person who might have violated some norm in the criminal law who gets killed by the cops. So yeah, gender certainly plays a role in that as well.
You know, but the sense that we, Lauren, that was a great question. So I don't, did I cut you off? Do you have another thing you want to ask?
No, I just said thank you. That was all.
Sorry. The sense that this is business we should be attending to, which the current law doesn't call us to that posture.
Right.
You know, that can happen with a change in leadership of saying this is something that's gone on too long, we need to deal with it. Maybe that'll happen. But another way, just to sort of connect it up to your critical race theory work, is to see that there's an interest convergence that might motivate change. And so maybe you could say a little bit about Derek Bell's interest convergence idea, and the standardization to me feels like it might have that kind of capacity.
Yeah, that's great. Oh my God, thanks for that question. I just got super excited about it because I started thinking about the insurrection capital. Okay, so here's what I'm thinking. So Derek Bell famously said that, or famously argued that the Civil Rights Acts, you know, and all this progress that we made in the 1960s around, you know, moving Black people into, you know, citizenship, at least as a formal matter. Those gains that we achieved were not because white people in power had some come to Jesus moment. It was not because they had an epiphany and they had, you know, they did the sort of moral work and they were like, oh, what we're doing is wrong. Instead, we made all this progress in the 1960s around civil rights because it was in white people with power's interest to do so. And the interest was born of the fact that during the 1960s, we were in the Cold War with Russia, and we were fighting with for, you know, dominance, world dominance, you know, against Russia, and we're trying to convince, you know, these developing nations that US, you know, side with us and not communist Russia because we are superior. Meanwhile, Russia's turning around and saying, you know, you talk about democracy, but the South is profoundly undemocratic. You talk about how much you value free and fair elections, and you want us to have free and, you know, fair elections in Poland, and you're not even doing that in Mississippi. So it was in the interest of the US in order to win the Cold War and to defeat Russia for, U.S. superiority on the global stage by passing the Civil Rights Act. So, right, interest convergence. So the interests of people in power, white people in power, converge with the interests of subordinated people of color. And we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and so and so. So interest convergence in the context of maternal health, or just health generally, would look like it would be in the interest of people with power to not sicken and kill people of color, right? And it's right today, as I sit, in front of this computer, it's hard for me to imagine what would make it in the interest of the country to save, Black people's lives, people of color's lives, Native people's lives, Latinx people, like what would make it in our interest, right? The country's interest to do better. But I definitely think like it's something on a global stage in which it would have to be some. I mean, my imagination might be limited by the context in which the concept was first articulated. So I'm thinking of like embarrassment because we're struggling against Russia or China or whoever it is for domination in some sphere, but I can't imagine anything beyond like a sort of global stage of competition. And the reason, and I said, I started thinking about the insurrection at the Capitol was that it is now in the interest of the country, people with power, to care about white supremacists, not to care about white supremacy, but to care about white supremacists. Because white supremacists, when left to their own devices, will take this whole thing down, right? It will take down all of our democratic institutions. So now we care about what white supremacists are up to, and we care about tracking them and arresting them and surveilling them, because it is now in the interest of people with power to curb their activities, right? You can't make a whole lot of money in a destabilized democracy. So now corporations are all about, anti-white supremacists. So yes, interest conversion.
Well, we see it a lot in the decarceration area. I mean, there are a lot of people that want to decarcerate populations because they care about them and they don't want to see people in cages. But you see legislatures or governors starting to decarcerate people because it's just too expensive to hold them, right? So there may be a cost convergence in this context also.
Yeah, in the reproductive justice space, I hate when people make arguments that, the Hyde Amendment is bad and we should fund, abortion care through Medicaid because, it's actually more expensive to care for childbirth than it is to care for abortion. It's like, that might be true, but it also limits our claim for like state assistance, right? The state's job is to help vulnerable people. It's not to save the state money. So yeah, we have to be really careful. It's interesting how some people have read interest convergence as like a program, right? Like instead of a critique, in which Derek Bell was articulating a critique, some people read it as like a program for getting something done. But it's dangerous, and I think you ultimately will fail.
Yeah, very much so. Sonia.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. And I, as you were speaking about interest convergence and maternal health, one of the things that we were actually talking about as the class started before you arrived was alternative maternal health birthing platforms, such as recruiting doulas and midwives. And there is such a grotesque presentation of this phenomenon of giving birth. In one way, it should be this unifying standard process. We all come up the same way, right, one way or the other. And yet in the same hospital, you may have on one floor lobster and champagne following birth. And then on another floor, you have the question of survival, simple survival. And moving beyond that, and I'm thinking now, these alternative modes, taking it out of the hospital, out of the institute, and there were such modes present, this sort of communal, more the midwife focused, more healthy, more holistic, more maternal health geared philosophies.
Mm-hmm.
And now even those seem to be they're being co-opted by these these indicators of privilege and wealth,
Mm-hmm.
where now a doula or midwife is not so much about communal health and maternal health. It is an indication of privilege.
Yeah.
It costs money, and it's becoming even more expensive because now they themselves are being regulated, and somebody spoke about that earlier, and they can expound on that more eloquently than I did. So I'm wondering what do you think about that now, as this co-option of these alternative maternal health platforms?
Yeah, excellent question. So that makes my brain go in a whole bunch of different directions. So one is when I type up, what are my research questions for this new ethnography, that question is one of them, which is, what are people's relationship to biomedicine and biomedical discourse, and how might those relationships be informed by race? So in reproducing race, I observed that a lot of the people who went to Alpha Hospital for their care chose Alpha Hospital in lieu of going to hospitals that were closer to their home, because they heard that it offered the best care. And by best, they meant you got screened for everything. You were getting weighed. It's just like a surfeit of technology was going to be brought to your body, right? And the reason why this was coveted was because for so long, poor people don't have access to healthcare, period. And so when you finally get access because you're pregnant, right? You want all of the stuff that you didn't have access. You've always had to care for a headache by laying down, right? So now you can actually get, some sort of like pharmaceutical for a headache. So, so the access to technology becomes a sign of privilege that people want to associate with themselves in order to have some of that privilege rub up, even if it's for like the discrete moment of, pregnancy and childbirth and the 8 weeks following childbirth. So that's one of the questions that's motivating my project. The second project is, when one has class privilege and lacks race privilege, what is the relationship to biomedicine? Do you still want a surfeit of technology? Do you still experience it as new, as something that has been denied to people of color in this country, But at the same time, in California and all across the country, there's a movement to get people out of hospitals because we are dying in there. When I say people, I mean people of color. Like, get people of color out of hospitals. Get them away from the Pitocin, get them away from the episiotomy, get them away from the C-sections, because we are literally dying at the hands of a very medicalized pregnancy and childbirth. So how might that choice, right, be understood in light of people's racial identities and descriptions? Right, so race is not unidirectional. Like, race can lead to one might say, opposite choices, but race informs both of them. And as a race scholar and a scholar of racialization, I'm interested in how race informs these desires and wants. So I'm led to say that in response to your question. I'm also led to think about how, yes, so having a doula and a midwife and having the privilege to birth outside of a hospital is in fact a privilege. You can't birth outside of a hospital if you live in public housing. You can't birth outside of a hospital if you've had an open ACS investigation. So birthing outside of a hospital and having, and taking advantage of these alternative maternal health platforms may in fact be a sign of privilege. And then you noted the cost, right? Part of New York City's intervention is to fund doula care through Medicaid. Because it's expensive, right? It can be expensive. And so we know that doulas improve health outcomes. And so part of the intervention in New York City is to say, okay, you guys, poor people can have access to doulas as well. So there's a democratization, if you will, of this, sign of privilege that, birthing with a doula, with a midwife, at home or outside of a hospital setting, we can democratize it through our healthcare systems. So anyway, those are the thoughts that your question led me to. One last thing I'll say, this book is actually out, or no, it's going to be out later this year. It's called Birthing Mothers, Birthing Black Mothers. And it's written by Jennifer Nash. Brilliant book. I just happened to read it before it came out. But it's a brilliant, brilliant study. And one of her, probably one of the most stunning insights that I read in the book, she asked, what does it mean for the Black maternal health crisis, for the solution to the Black maternal health crisis to be framed as in the hands of untrained, underpaid birth workers like doulas, right? What does it mean that our commitment to saving Black people's lives, that commitment manifests through handing over the birth process, or at least having doulas be present when doulas, again, are not covered by most insurances, and they don't have the training that a midwife or an obstetrician or a nurse practitioner or right? What does it mean that that's our solution to this crisis, that we are willing to devote so few resources to it, and put it in the hands of people who sort of take their calling, their practice, their engagement in this space to be one motivated by racial justice. So anyway, it's just a beautiful book that I think you might be interested in looking into.
It's a great and hard question.
Yeah.
Let me ask our last question and then we'll let you run. To what extent has COVID exacerbated the existing inequalities / morbidities in the Black community? Not of getting COVID, but just the stress on the healthcare system, I assume. I live very close to Harlem Hospital, and it's pretty rough over there on a good day,
Right.
For any patient that presents.
Mm-hmm.
But the stress that COVID's put on our hospitals has been pretty rough. So are you looking at data or hearing stories about that?
So the data coming out is interesting. Seems like maternal health outcomes have improved in light of COVID. And so everybody's wondering why. Everybody's wondering why. But the initial data shows that COVID, then the changes that COVID has produced or demanded of our healthcare delivery is actually leading to lower rates of infant mortality and lower rates of maternal mortality. So a couple of things to say about that. So COVID definitely was the negative, one of the most talked about negative consequences of COVID was that hospitals started saying that only one person can be present in the labor and delivery room, which means that, and by one person, I mean the birthing person, which means that people were left to birth by themselves. So like no partner, no family, no doula, which going back to the previous question, doulas are known to save lives, produce better health outcomes. So we were creating this circumstance where people are being stripped of this mechanism, right? This individual who we know improves outcomes. So that was one of the stresses of COVID. But the data coming out showed that birth outcomes were improving. And the idea here is, when I talked to actually doulas in Brooklyn, at Ancient Song doula organization, they were telling me that before COVID, hospitals would tell them, oh, that's not possible. No, we just, we need pregnant people to come in here and get weighed. oh, we need pregnant people to come in here and so that we could test their urine for protein to make sure they're not getting preeclampsia. Oh, and we need to hook them up to that, monitors just to make sure there's no distress in the fetus. And when COVID happened, we saw that all of these things that hospitals said were impossible, they were very possible. Like, you actually didn't need to come into the hospital to get weighed. You could weigh yourself at home. You actually didn't need to come into the hospital to test your urine for protein because you could do it at home. You actually didn't need to be monitored, hooked up to a fetal monitor, which might restrict your movement when you were, in labor, because, that would require one additional person to enter into the room, and that increases your likelihood of contracting COVID, or they're contracting COVID from you. So all of these things that hospitals said were impossible were in fact possible. And then we see sort of improved health outcomes at the end of it. So it suggests, right, that part of the poor health outcomes that we see are a function of the way that we do birth in this country, and we might reimagine it and start looking into it, as previous questions said, we might start looking into not medicalizing birth in a way, allowing people to birth outside of the hospital, allowing people to do prenatal care in group settings. I'm actually, one of my sites for this new ethnography is a group prenatal care setting. So instead of having a provider take your blood pressure, you take your homegirl's blood pressure, takes her homegirl's blood pressure. So you're caring for each other. So those sorts of interventions might have actually led to the improved health outcomes that we see in light of COVID.
Wow. Well, that is way cool in a way I hadn't anticipated. Thank you so much for the work. And consistently, since when I first met you and you were doing your ethnographic work here in New York, and then just where your scholarship has gone. It's really critically important. I was on the phone with Nina Martin the other day for about an hour talking about other things, and I told her you were going to be coming to the class, and she's like, "Oh, I love her work." Nina Martin is a reporter, a journalist with ProPublica, who's written a lot on maternal mortality and other things. So I just want to say thank you for coming tonight, or this afternoon for you, and running from your other meeting and really entertaining some hard questions, because this is a really tough topic.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure talking. There's nothing that I'd rather do than talk about, these issues. I'm passionate about them. So it was a joy to have such smart engagement with the stuff that I love for 2 hours. So
good. All right. Thank you so much, Khiara. Be well, be safe.
Bye. Take care, everybody.
Bye.